Beijing is stepping up its presence in the South China Sea. The Chinese government has maneuvered hundreds of militia ships into the disputed waters, effectively blocking access for the maritime activities of other nations. A report in the New York Times says China is attempting to, quote, accomplish by overwhelming presence what it has been unable to do through diplomacy or international law. China's recent moves come after they built and fortified with military bases a series of man-made islands in the region starting in 2014. They did so despite competing claims from Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. The U.S. has no official position on territorial claims in the South China Sea, but has criticized China's tactics. U.S. Navy warships have been dispatched to patrol the area 3 times since President Biden took office. The New York Times Beijing bureau chief, Stephen Lee Myers, joins me now from Seoul, South Korea. Thank you very much, Stephen, for being with us. So what do these latest moves say about China's military and political posture?
I think China is very intent on controlling these claims that they've made virtually over all of the South China Sea, based on historical claims that these have been traditional fishing grounds for the Chinese for centuries. And they've built up islands, as you mentioned, that out of what were essentially just reefs, uninhabited spaces. Over the last few years, they've built entire cities on them. And in this case, what they've done is in a reef that's claimed by the Philippines, parked essentially hundreds of ships, beginning in March and then continuing even now, despite the protests that the Philippines and the Vietnamese have made.
And how are nations with competing claims responding to China's recent moves, and how does the need for vaccines complicate this?
Well, in the case of the Philippines, once they noticed the presence of so many ships, at one point more than 200, they protested diplomatically by calling in the ambassador in Manila. But there's not a lot they can do other than use force to expel them. And that's the challenge for these other nations. The Philippines, Vietnam also claims the same islands in this area. And, you know, it's obviously a major escalation to use force against the ships. And I think China knows that. In the case, you know, in the Philippines in particular, you know, they are relying on Chinese vaccines to handle the pandemic. And some of those arrived, in fact, just last week, the first batch, and they're expecting more. So it's a delicate dance that they have to conduct with the Chinese, you know, to protect with their own claims, but then also not alienate the Chinese government.
Can we just take a step back for a moment? You touched on this a moment ago, but how massive an undertaking has this been for China with respect to building up these areas? You talked about, for instance, building up on a reef that had been claimed by the Philippines as territory of the Philippines. But when you talk about building up what essentially is infrastructure, right, in the South China Sea, there really was nothing like this there just a few years ago.
Yeah, these are the Spratly Islands, which are a collection of more than 100 essentially reefs, rocks. Some of them don't even qualify under international law as an island. But what the Chinese began to do several years ago was essentially dredge up sand and build their own islands on several of these spots in the Spratlys. And, you know, they did so in you know, territory that was claimed by both Vietnam and the Philippines, partly by Malaysia and Brunei. And, you know, they've since then built military bases, airfields that can land some of their biggest jets. And, you know, on those, they're able to conduct patrols and so forth. What they're doing now, it seems, is that they're using these ostensibly fishing vessels, big trawlers, to maintain a steady presence there in the seas, in these waters, which is forcing out the Vietnamese fishermen, the Philippine fishermen, and that seems to be the intent, is that they don't have to use force. It seems they don't want to shoot at the local fishermen. But by being there with so many ships, they're able to essentially force out everyone else.
And in our final couple of minutes here, what has been the United States response, and what is their official position and posture on these developments in the South China Sea?
This has been a contentious issue going back now to the Obama administration, when the Chinese first began building these islands. And, we the United States government opposes unilateral declarations in this region. In other words, they prefer that it be negotiated settlements. And what the Chinese are doing is essentially, trying to create a fait accompli, that they are there, their presence, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. The United States doesn't take an official position on the territorial claims themselves, but they do oppose, and they were very critical of these Chinese developments, and including building the artificial islands, and then obviously militarizing them. The United States does take a position on the freedom of navigation through these waters. China essentially claims that because these are their islands, the United States or other navies cannot pass through them under international law, which the United States makes a point of showing that they can by passing through on these operations, essentially sailing through these waters. And that's what the Biden administration has already done 3 times since taking office in January.
Finally, Stephen, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken expressed support for the Philippines, tweeting, quote, "We will always stand by our allies and stand up for the rules-based international order." Top Chinese and U.S. officials recently met. Was this officially on the agenda? And is there clarity on what future U.S. support for the Philippines might look like? For people who don't know, there's a long history between the United States and the Philippines, dating back to 1898 and Spain ceding control of the Philippines to the United States. But there have been American military bases, as you know, Stephen, that some might be asking, is it time to have a more robust American presence near the South China Sea?
I think what the Secretary of State has indicated since coming to office, and certainly in the meetings with the Chinese, is that they want to work with allies who I think feel like in recent years have been neglected somewhat. The relationship with the Philippines has been contentious, and it remains to be seen whether or not they could go back to the kind of more robust partnership that there once was, at least in terms of military, cooperation. But I think that Secretary of State Blinken indicated that the United States was prepared to, work more closely with the Philippines, with this statement that they were willing to stand by. We've seen a very aggressive posture towards the Chinese in the new administration, and I think this will be part of that, and could lead to greater confrontation in the months ahead.
We'll continue to watch it. Stephen Lee Myers. Stephen, I know it's very early where you are. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Good to be with you.